Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Today's our 8th talk in the Cold War Spaces series. And it's Pride Month, it's June, and today's topic is queer spaces in East Germany, between persecution and liberation, with Samuel Huneke. He's a historian of modern Europe and is currently assistant professor of history at George Mason University. His focus is on the social and political history of 19th and 20th century Germany. And he's currently working on a book that examines gay persecution and liberation in Germany during the Cold War. He's also doing research for a project that examines crimes against humanity trials in Allied occupied Germany. And today he'll be in conversation with the Wende's chief curator and director of programming, Joes Segal, for a 30-minute talk. And after that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience for about 10 minutes. So have your questions ready to put in the Q&A box. And we've been getting a lot of questions and good questions, so we apologize in advance if we can't get to yours. I'd also like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting the discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. Yes, let's get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. Life is too rich, too surprising, and too subjectively experienced to say with confidence that we can learn from the past. But by looking into history, we can expand our horizon, broaden our perspective, and question our preconceived ideas and beliefs. In the Western world, we have strongly believed that communism stands for a lack of freedom, especially for people with different opinions or lifestyles. In the history of the real existing Soviet bloc countries, there is a lot to support that claim. On the other hand, the staunchest critics of communist suppression have not always been the most open-minded with regard to divergent opinions and lifestyles in their own countries. Today, in the middle of Pride Month, we are going to talk about queer spaces in East Germany. How restricted was the LGBTQ community in this communist country? How did their legal situation compare to the reality of everyday life? And how does all of this relate to the Western world? I'm delighted to discuss these questions with our special guest today, Samuel Huneke. Samuel, welcome to Cold War Spaces. And let me start by going a bit deeper into history. East and West Germany were founded on the ruins of the defeated Third Reich. How did the GDR and West Germany cope with the heritage of the Nazi persecution of minorities, among them homosexuals, many of whom died in the concentration camps?
Well, Joes, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you with the Wende Museum, which is such a special place. In answer to your question, I think it's important to maybe start for those who aren't familiar with what exactly homosexuals suffered under the Nazi regime. The National Socialists were deeply homophobic, and in 1935, 2 years into National Socialist rule, they promulgated a new, harsher version of paragraph 175, which is the law that criminalized homosexuality, male homosexuality specifically. That harsher version of the law criminalized a much more expansive range of activities. And so you have about 50,000 gay men who were prosecuted under the law, convicted under the law, and around 5,000 to 15,000 gay men were sent to concentration camps, where many of them bore the infamous pink triangle. Mm-hmm. That is a topic that still is being researched, and there's still a lot of wonderful research coming out about it. Some estimates hold that about 60% of those with the pink triangle died in the camps.
Right.
After the war, there was a really difficult sort of reckoning with the legacy of Nazi crimes. West Germany, under Konrad Adenauer, its first chancellor, was much more inclined to sort of sweep the past under the rug, to sort of forgive and forget and move on. A lot of Nazi bureaucrats actually were put back into their positions or given their pensions in the early 1950s. At the same time, there was a move to, in particular, recognize West Germany's guilt vis-a-vis the Jewish population. And Adenauer actually negotiated a sort of reparations package with the state of Israel. Homosexuals were not part of that, though, and were not recognized as victims of National Socialism. Similarly, in East Germany, there was a much greater impetus to look at victims of National Socialism through the lens of socialism and to see, in particular, socialists and communists as the primary victims of National Socialism. There too, homosexuals were not recognized as sort of legitimate victims of National Socialism.
Right. And I suppose nor were the Jewish victims in a very clear and straightforward way. Yeah.
No. I mean, there was some recognition in East Germany of the place of Jewish victims in the Holocaust under National Socialism, but certainly not commensurate with the actual magnitude of the murder and loss that the Jewish population, both in Germany and in Europe, had experienced under the Nazis.
Right. Yeah, so I guess in the early years, especially in East Germany, it seems that the official standpoint vis-a-vis homosexuals was rather harsh. In the 1950s, same-sex activity was viewed as a remnant of bourgeois decadence, as it was called, and a threat to the social and political health of the nation. So how did the state act on that verdict?
So that's a wonderful question, and also it's something I'm address in my book manuscript that I'm in the middle of working on right now. It's something that a few other scholars have tried to address, that East Germany actually had a very sort of ambivalent view of homosexuality. And in part, this goes back to a very long tradition of communism and socialism sort of ambivalence around sexuality, around gender and sexuality in general, in fact. So very early on in East Germany's existence, the court system actually in part reverted to the earlier sort of less harsh version of paragraph 175, this law criminalizing male homosexuality. In 1950, the Supreme Court of East Germany went back to the Weimar era version, the pre-Nazi version, but then there had been a sub-paragraph that the Nazi state had introduced that criminalized things like male prostitution and the so-called seduction of youth, this idea that older gay men seduced young men into lives of homosexuality. That sub-paragraph it kept. So you have this sort of partial liberalization. There also were early attempts to get rid of the law criminalizing adult consensual homosexuality. To some extent, those reform efforts really faltered after the 1953, the June uprisings, the massive uprisings in East Germany that were put down with Soviet troops. That really rattled the regime. Some scholars have pointed to that moment as a moment when the regime went back to a much more sort of conservative notion of public morals and reasserted more sort of patriarchal and so-called traditional views of gender and sexuality in the family as a way of trying to bolster support. It also led to personnel changes that were quite significant for our story. Max Fechner, who was he was a former member of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, and he was the Minister of Justice. And he was purged after those 1953 uprisings, in part because he was himself homosexual.
Right.
So you have this sort of ambivalent place of homosexuality legally. At the same time, as you point out, there was this strong notion that homosexuality was a remnant of capitalism. So if you look at, for instance, newspaper articles, there's a very clear trend, especially after 1953, of newspaper articles, which were all, of course, subject to public censorship, casting homosexuality as part of the sort of degenerate West, something that was coming out of capitalism, coming out of the West, and was sort of threatening this sort of socialist, moral workers' paradise, if you will.
I see.
So you have this very strange situation of a somewhat more liberalized legal setting. You have far fewer prosecutions under paragraph 175 in East Germany than you do in West Germany. And West Germany had kept the Nazi era law. But then you have this ongoing stigmatization and persecution in some areas.
Yeah, so how did that work out in practice in, say, the 1950s until the mid-1960s? What was the effect for people in real life?
It really varied. In my own research, I've come across evidence that the regime mostly cared about homosexuality when they found it within its own ranks. So when they found party members who were gay, when they found officers of the Stasi, the secret police, who were gay, police officers, members of the military, and so forth, it seems that for most East Germans, for sort of ordinary East Germans who were gay, they had more of an opportunity to live out their sexuality than perhaps they would have in West Germany. That said, because of the nature of the socialist economy, there were far fewer things like bars that catered to queer people in East Germany than there were in West Germany. So again, you have this very ambivalent situation of a far more relaxed legal landscape, and in some ways a darker sort of social or cultural landscape.
Right, right. And then maybe speaking about the legal landscape, in 1968, homosexuality was officially decriminalized in East Germany. Maybe surprisingly, that happened only 1 year later in West Germany. So what motivated this change in the law, and why is it, do you think, that West Germany actually lagged behind here?
That's a really good question. So in East Germany, it was a very technocratic process. There were a handful of lawyers and sexologists, doctors, who had been advocating for this reform really since the regime was founded. Rudolf Klemmer, who was a sexologist, was one in particular who had pushed for this reform. So in East Germany, it was a very technocratic process. As I mentioned, already in the early 1950s, there had been talk of getting rid of the ban on adult consensual homosexuality. So that was a reform that didn't really come about with much fanfare or much sort of public discussion. Already, even in 1957, the East German state had passed a supplementary criminal code, which for the most part said that any crime had to have some sort of injurious consequence, either for an individual or for the state. And this was interpreted to mean that in most cases, adult consensual homosexuality would not be punished any longer because there was no victim, as it were. There were still cases, as I've mentioned, of party members, say, being prosecuted under the law because their conduct was seen to have injurious consequences for the GDR. So already in the late 50s, for most gay East Germans, there was this sort of legal liberalization. In West Germany, as I mentioned, the state kept the Nazi-era law. And over the course of 2 decades, between 1949 and 1969, over 50,000 gay men were convicted under the law. So it's a very different legal landscape.
Right.
And there it became a very prominent topic of public conversation by the sort of early 60s. And the public sort of discourse around reforming that law really gained steam in the mid-1960s, and that's very much wrapped up with things like the sexual revolution in West Germany, the student movement, and a growing awareness of sort of Nazi crimes. So there it was a much more public sort of effort or a push that also required a change in political leadership. So in the mid-60s, the coalition of CDU and FDP faltered, and you have the Grand Coalition come in, where the SPD, for the first time in West German history, takes seats in the cabinet. And one of those individuals was Gustav Heinemann, who took the position of justice minister. And that allowed him, he was a progressive, he wanted to reform this law. And because he was the justice minister, that gave him this portfolio. So you see 2 very different paths to sort of a legal liberalization in the late 1960s.
I see, yeah. And did the 2 German countries actually look at each other and be aware of each other's laws and social practices?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in both cases, you have, in particular, those who advocated keeping the criminalization of homosexuality, looking across the border for evidence that this was a good idea. So in East Germany, as I've mentioned, you have this propaganda that indicates that homosexuality is something that comes out of the West, comes out of capitalism, that very much is seen to sort of support keeping this criminalization. In the West, conservatives very much look to East Germany and their more relaxed legal setting to basically say, the communists are pro-gay, they're pro-homosexual, and that's yet another reason why we should keep the criminalization of homosexuality in our country.
Interesting, right. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about the cultural life of homosexuals in East Germany? Did they carve out their own spaces? Were they allowed to do so, or were they confronted by the Stasi? How did that work?
So that's a really wonderful question, and something that my own research really focuses on, and it's a question that a number of scholars have become increasingly interested in the last sort of decade or so. So in the 50s and 60s, you start having efforts, especially in cities like East Berlin, to carve out some sort of space for queer people. Right. There are a number of bars by the early 1960s, at least in East Berlin, that cater to gay people. This isn't official. They're obviously not advertising in that way, but it's sort of known. You also have a very rich sort of cruising scene, very similar to what you would have had in West Germany, where gay men know to go to certain public toilets, forests, train stations, that sort of thing, or public baths to look for sex. One other thing that I've discovered is a very rich scene of house parties, especially in the larger cities, where gay men who had large apartments would invite dozens of people that they knew or perhaps only knew fleetingly over for these sorts of parties. And there's evidence of this that shows up in police files and in particular Stasi files. The first sort of effort to create any sort of systematic group for gay people was the Homosexuellen Interessengemeinschaft Berlin, or the Homosexual Interest Group or Interest Community Berlin, which got its start in the early 1930s. And essentially, this was around the era that you had gay liberation movements springing up in West Germany, in West Berlin. And some of those activists who were themselves committed socialists would go across the border into East Berlin, and they would meet with gay people there. And some of those gay people got it into their own heads that they would start their own gay liberation organization. And so actually the image behind me is from the Weltfestspiele of 1973, this sort of gathering of socialists from around the world. And during that event, Peter Tatchell, who was a gay liberation activist from Great Britain, came and sort of led a protest for gay rights in East Berlin. And involved in those protests were some of these young East Berlin gay activists. So they created this group, the HIB, which eventually started meeting in the Gründerzeit Museum of Charlotte von Mahlsdorf, a famous trans woman who we can talk more about in a bit. And so they would host all kinds of events. They would host queer cabarets, poetry readings, lectures. They really endeavored to create a sort of cultural scene for queer people in the East German capital, as well as pressuring the East German regime to sort of acknowledge them as a minority.
Yeah, would you say that's a kind of looking back to the Weimar period in a certain sense? It sounds like this atmosphere a little bit. Or...
It does. No, I mean, certainly they were aware of what had been happening in Weimar in the 1920s. But to some extent, they also were trying to chart their own path. Many of them were committed socialists and saw what they were doing as part of the socialist project. And they wanted to convince the regime that homosexuals could be part of quote unquote real existing socialism. Right. And so it certainly has references to what was both happening across the border and what had happened in Germany decades prior, but was very much its own project.
Right. So you mentioned Charlotte von Mahlsdorf, one of the very colorful transgender women, I guess, in East Germany. Can you tell us a little bit about, very briefly, about her life and maybe also her interaction with the Stasi, which I think is interesting?
So she had grown up in the Nazi era and had actually, at least in her autobiography, she says that she killed her own father, who was an ardent Nazi. She then lived in East Berlin. She trained in sort of to work in museums and collected a very large collection of furniture and curios from the Gründerzeit, from the period after Germany's initial unification in 1871. And she was very dedicated to these old sort of palaces that the Soviets and the East Germans were taking away from private hands and putting into essentially public trust and oftentimes tearing down. And so she managed to save this villa, this palace in Marsdorf, which is sort of a neighborhood of East Berlin. And she set up a museum for the Gründerzeit, for this period of imperial German history there. In the process of sort of collecting furniture, she actually managed to save the bar, the physical bar, from a sort of Weimar era and imperial era queer bar in East Berlin, the Müllakritze. And so that space where that bar was in the cellars of her villa is where the HIB eventually started meeting. She herself actually was a Stasi IM, a unofficial collaborator. And this is something that historians of East Germany really struggle with, to think about what exactly is the role of these IMs. Estimates are that around 5% of the East German population served in this capacity. That is, that they would pass information onto the Stasi. So that's a huge percentage of the population. And what's become very clear through this research is that East Germans had various motivations for serving as an IM. Sometimes they were blackmailed or extorted into it. Sometimes it came about because they genuinely believed in the regime. Sometimes they had their own sort of beefs with neighbors or family members or whatever that they wanted to use this association to resolve. So anyway, but in Charlotte von Marsdorf's case, she in 1978, the Stasi, or actually the local Berlin police, sort of prevented a meeting of lesbians from taking place at the villa. And for her, she was then threatened with the museum being taken away from her. And so she stopped allowing the HIB to meet there, which sort of spelled the end of the HIB as an organization, but then led to a new sort of wave of queer activism in the 1980s.
Right, thank you. So another point is that generally speaking, I guess the church in West Germany was rather conservative with regards to questions of homosexuality. But in East Germany, the Protestant church had a quite different role. Can you comment a little on that? Yeah.
So this is something that people oftentimes find very striking about the East German sort of case, that in the early 1980s, gay activists started to organize under the umbrella of the Protestant church in East Germany. And a huge number of these so-called working circles sprang up around the country by around 1985. The reason, I mean, to understand why this was, you really have to look at the history of the Protestant church in East Germany. When East Germany was first founded, around 16 million of the 17 million East German citizens belonged to the Protestant church. And so it was a huge organization. It was really the only organization that was never fully co-opted into the East German system of rule. The East Germans did everything they could, the regime did everything it could to sort of weaken the power of the church. And by the 1980s, only a few million, I believe around 5 million East Germans identified with the Protestant church. But it was still a sizable part of the population. And for people who had been identified as opponents of the regime, it oftentimes provided really the only opportunity for a career or for advancement. And so historians of East Germany have pointed out that by the 1980s, it really was this sort of safety valve for the regime, where those who were disaffected or opponents of the regime could sort of go to have a social life, to have a career, et cetera. And so by the 1980s, other oppositional groups such as, or perceived oppositional groups such as the Independent Peace Movement and the environmental movement had also organized under the umbrella of the Protestant church.
Right.
And when gay people wanted to do it, this wasn't a, this was not a non-contentious issue. The higher ups in the church were very much opposed to it, and very much still espoused the sort of conservative views of sexuality that we would associate with a Christian church in that period.
Right.
But because the East German Protestant Church was really a sort of loose collection of regional churches, and that gave individual pastors or vicars a great deal of power over what they did in their own parish or in their own church. And so that meant that certain young, usually younger, leaders in the church could welcome these groups in these working circles into their church and to give them space to meet and resources to sort of spread word about what they were doing, even without the approval of, say, the relevant bishop in their area.
Right. So it seems that in the late 1980s, there were some fundamental changes. For instance, the Supreme Court ruled that homosexual people had the same civil rights as everyone else. There was the German Hygiene Museum in Dresden, who commissioned a documentary film about same-sex love. And then there is the film coming out, which has this wonderful story because it premiered on the day of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Can you say a little bit about these changes in the late 1980s?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad you asked that. That really, when I was sort of starting research for my book, that was one of the core questions I had, was basically, how did these changes come about? It's so counterintuitive. East Germany was thought of as one of the most inflexible dictatorships in the Eastern Bloc by the late 80s. And so it doesn't seem like intuitively like a good candidate for these sorts of changes to have come about. Essentially, what happened is, as I mentioned, you had this movement essentially spreading within the Protestant church. You had these working groups that were popping up all over the country. At the same time, you started having secular groups that also appeared because they didn't want to organize within the church. Either they thought of the church as homophobic inherently, or they were committed socialists in some cases. And so the Stasi, the secret police, really, of course, was very anxious about this. The East German regime was inherently paranoid and very suspicious of any sort of independent organizing, political organizing. And so immediately this sort of got their attention. At the same time, the activists really focused on activism that would get the regime's attention. So for instance, they organized petition campaigns for things like getting the right to place personal advertisements in newspapers. They also started organizing summer outings to concentration camps to lay wreaths honoring the homosexual victims of Nazism. So these were things that were designed to get the regime's attention. Eventually, the Stasi decided on a two-pronged approach. On one hand, further repression, that they would much more aggressively infiltrate these groups and try to sort of stop them from meeting. On the other hand, they acknowledged that these groups had a point, that there were sort of deficiencies in how the East German state treated queer people, and that they would encourage relevant ministries to start actually addressing those problems. And so that's really a quite striking thing, that you here have a secret police force that's encouraging a dictatorship to take these demands seriously. And so that's why starting in the mid-1980s, you see this whole slew that you alluded to of really progressive gay reforms. You have gay discos that actually started appearing in 1984 in East German cities. You have state-sanctioned groups, such as gay groups of the Free German Youth, the FDJ. There's a book that is commissioned that comes out in 87, I believe, about homosexuality. The East German military actually institutes a new policy in 1988 saying that gay soldiers can serve. There's the Supreme Court decision that equalizes the age of consent. The country's vast network of marriage and sex counseling centers are encouraged to take on gay patients and counsel them around issues like coming out or suicidal ideation, which we know affects LGBT populations in higher numbers. So you have all these really progressive changes that essentially stem from a deep-seated paranoia about independent political organizing. So coming out is part of those changes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would also love to ask you about what the fall of the Berlin Wall actually meant for homosexual communities in East Germany, but we are hitting the half-hour mark, so I'm moving to the Q&A now, and maybe we can, if there is time, we can still come
Okay.
back to this question. But there
Great.
are already several questions here. Let me start with Daisy Smith. You mentioned laws against male homosexuality. Were there also laws against female homosexuality?
That's a really wonderful question. There were not any explicit laws against female homosexuality, other with one notable exception. In 1968, when East Germany legalized adult homosexuality, they implemented a new law known as Paragraph 151 that set a higher age of consent for homosexual acts. They set the age of consent at 18. And that law did include lesbians, so for both male and female homosexual acts. That's the only law in modern German history that criminalizes any sort of lesbian conduct. That is not, however, to say that lesbians were not discriminated against. It has, however, made it much more difficult for historians to write the history of sort of state persecution of lesbians, both, in the Weimar period and the Nazi period, and then in the Cold War period.
Right.
But it's something that some historians have started looking at. In East Germany, for instance, there's evidence that lesbian women were at a disadvantage when it came to divorce proceedings, and especially their children would oftentimes be taken away from them if they were sort of acknowledged to be lesbians.
Right. There's here another question, which I actually planned to ask you, but didn't because of the time. How did East German policy vis-à-vis gay and lesbian life differ from other Central European countries?
That's another really wonderful question. The Eastern Bloc, I think, as you sort of alluded to in your introduction, we tend to see the Eastern Bloc as this monolithic thing that maybe doesn't change. And actually, you have a huge range of different sort of policies across the Eastern Bloc. So sort of at the worst end of the spectrum is the USSR itself, which actually recriminalized homosexuality under Stalin. Scholars of homosexuality in the USSR have argued that after Stalinism, you actually have, rather than a decrease in sort of homophobia, continued increase in homophobia and sort of prosecution of gay people. And homosexuality was only decriminalized in 1993, I believe, after the fall of communism. Other countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were much more progressive. Hungary and Czechoslovakia decriminalized homosexuality in the early 1960s, so at least formally on paper earlier than East Germany did. And they also had if not thriving, then at least thriving for the Eastern Bloc standards, sort of gay scene in their large cities in Prague and Budapest. And both Poland and Czechoslovakia had sort of initial gay groups in the 1980s. Poland actually cracked down on their gay scene quite brutally in the mid-1980s in what was known as Operation Hyacinth. So you have this varied range. I think by the late 1980s, East Germany is definitely the most sort of progressive of the bunch, but across the Cold War, you have a real variety.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there is a question here from Bruce Hollyham. It's multi-part question, but I think some of it has already been covered, so I'm focusing on the first part. Prior to the GDR, do you know how well Ernst Röhm and Hermann Göring's homosexuality was common knowledge during the Third Reich?
Göring I had not heard of before as being gay. Ernst Röhm, though, was well known as a homosexual. He had been outed by the SPD in a very sort of public way right before the Nazis came to power. For those who don't know, he was the leader of the SA, the stormtroopers, the infamous brown shirts. He, of course, was murdered in the Night of Long Knives in 1934, which was essentially an internal party coup. That coup had numerous reasons, prominent among them because the army, the German army, didn't trust the SA, the paramilitary of the Nazi party. However, Hitler and Himmler, the leader of the SS, used Röhm's homosexuality as a sort of reason for this purge. They claimed that Röhm and other gay people in the SA had been planning a coup against the state, and that this was sort of designed to head that off. There's no evidence that that's true. However, that stereotype of the gay clique and the threat it posed to the state actually became a quite prominent mainstay of Nazi ideology.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. The next question is by Marcel Rotter. Could you name the gay FDJ group? So FDJ, Freie Deutsche Jugend, is the East German youth movement. Growing up in the GDR and being in the FDJ, I did never come across them.
Yeah, so one of them was called Rosalinde, and then there was one, the name of which is escaping me right now, in Weimar, Felix Halle, named after a gay Weimar era member of the Communist Party. These were only founded very late in the 1980s, sort of 87, 88, around then. And they weren't in every city.
Right, okay, thank you. So I'm very happy to see the next question by Lotte Tam, because it's exactly the question I wanted to ask. Hey there, thanks for the wonderful lunch, or in my Berlin case, evening talk. I have a question about 89-90. Would you consider reunification a setback for the LGBTQ communities in East Germany?
That's a really good question. And it's something I've started thinking about a lot more. And I think a lot of other historians and scholars of queerness in modern Germany have also started thinking about more. I'm not sure if setback is the right word, but I do think that obviously a lot changed. And you can see that on various levels. So gay men and lesbian women were very excited to experience the West when the wall first fell. And many of them have recorded the sort of subjective sense of being disappointed with the commercialized subculture that they encountered there. The gay subculture that had evolved in East Germany was much more private. It was much more dependent on interpersonal links. And they felt that what they experienced in the West was sort of not what it was chalked up to be. It was not what they had sort of imagined it to be. You can see it also with AIDS, HIV and AIDS. East Germany had a very low number of AIDS cases. And in part, it's thought that the wall and the Iron Curtain actually was one of the reasons for this as well. I mean, the government actually responded to it quite quickly. But so Der Spiegel, Germany's West Germany's main publication or periodical of record, actually ran an article saying the Berlin Wall was the condom of the GDR, to express this sort of prophylactic function it had had. When it comes to the age of consent, West Germany still had an unequal age of consent, and East German politicians were very reluctant to allow that to then be reimposed on East Germany. And so that's actually something where you can see progress coming about because of East Germany, where the reunified Bundestag in 1994 actually finally got rid of the last remnants of paragraph 175, and it explicitly to bring West Germany's legal code into line with East Germany's. You can also see there's a huge, as many scholars have noted, there was a huge upswing in violence against minorities in the wake of reunification. And most of the attention has gone to violence against immigrants and non-white people in Germany. But queer people also experienced upswing in violence. And the thought is that the sort of economic devastation of reunification unleashed a lot of these animuses against various minority groups. So I don't know if setback's entirely the right word, but it certainly changed a lot. And I think a lot of the progress of the late 1980s in East Germany was sort of lost in this change to a new economic and political system.
Right, thank you. Next question is by Donald Keenan. If the East German paragraph 175 did not result in convictions, were the cruising spaces in East Germany not targeted by entrapment policing, as was common in Western countries? These were not surveyed as antisocial spaces? Question mark.
So no, you still have police surveilling those cruising spots. Men could still be arrested or harassed. You also had, as in the West, young men, sometimes posing or actually working as so-called rent boys or prostitutes, who would hang out in these areas and either attack or try to blackmail the men who showed up. So the cruising spaces were not safe in any sense of the word. And you certainly still had a policy of police, especially in the early years, harassing gay men. So, this is always the danger of looking just at the legal regime as opposed to sort of holistically at the total social experience. Because if you just looked at the law, you would think East Germany would be this great place for gay men in the 1950s and 60s, which it wasn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Wolf Gruner. From my own observation, I know that there were connections between gays and lesbians from the West and East in the 1980s in Berlin. There were a lot of personal visits from the West. Did these visits go beyond just personal meetups, parties, or did this influence the self-organization of gay groups under the church and beyond?
That's a really good question. So certainly the meetups in the 1970s influenced what the political aspirations of East German gay activists. By the 1980s, I think they're certainly still looking at the West and looking to what's going on in West Germany for inspiration. But ironically, in the 1980s, the gay movement in West Germany became a lot less overtly political. You sort of had a bifurcation where the movement proper was much more concerned with social and cultural programming and events, and also with HIV and AIDS. And then you had things like the Green Party, which sort of carried the political message of the movement into parliament, but the connection between the two was somewhat severed in the early 1980s. Whereas in East Germany, the 1980s is a sort of moment of blossoming political activism for gay people. I felt like I had one of the, and the other thing I was going to say is that by the mid-1980s, West Germans are actually looking at what's going on in the East to some extent with jealousy or with a sense that more progress is happening in the East. I found cases of people writing into gay magazines in the West asking for tips about where to go on their holiday to East Germany, or if they knew anyone there who they could sort of set them up with. So there's a sense almost that something is changing in East Germany by the mid-1980s, and coupled with a sense of stagnation in West Germany.
Right. Daisy Smith asks, could you please say again the name of the trans woman you were talking about? It's Charlotte von Malsdorf. Are there any books about her?
Yes, she wrote an autobiography called Ich bin meine eigene Frau, or I Am My Own Wife. It also, I believe, was turned into both a movie and a one woman or one person act. So there's quite a bit about her.
Right, okay. Then I have Disa Lindgren here. Of the many gay and lesbian people involved in the resistance to the Nazis in East Germany, is there a particular story of any individual or group that you could share?
Oh, of queer people
resisting the Nazis and then living in East Germany?
That's a good question. None are immediately springing to mind. I mean, most of the folks who I focused on in my own research were people who were born after the Nazi period. Sort of from another, I also do research on lesbians in Nazi Germany, and one of my favorite stories there is the story of Martha Halusa and Margot Lieu, who were a couple and were persecuted in part because of their lesbianism, or at least they were denounced because of their lesbianism, but they were also, they resisted Nazism. Margot Lieu was actually a Jewish German who married a Chinese man to get Chinese citizenship and escape being sent to a concentration camp, and has this sort of remarkable story. And they lived in the Soviet sector immediately after the war, and applied for recognition as victims of Nazism. However, what's interesting is that they didn't do it on the basis of their sexuality. They did it on the basis of them having been socialists who resisted, or anti-fascist fighters who resisted Nazism.
Right. So I guess our time is up. Again, my apologies for the questions that could not be answered by this time. But Samuel, I want to thank you very much for your very rich and informative presentation. I enjoyed it a lot.
Well, thank you for having me. This was incredibly enjoyable, and thank you everyone for your wonderful questions.
Right. So the next interview next week is with Kate Brown, Professor of Science, Technology and Society at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, under the title Contaminated Spaces, Long Radioactive Half-Lives and Short Media Cycles in Chernobyl. Hope to see you then. Thank you.